Good morning. Welcome all to this tour of St. Augustine Cemetery. We're pleased to have you here this morning, and we thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Barrasso. I am the Director of Operations for the Manchester Historic Association. I'll introduce to you our board members who are present as well, Richard Duckoff and Gail York. Our board does a lot for our organization. We thank them for all that they do. The Manchester Historic Association, I know many of you are members. It is a member-driven organization. We rely on support of our members for our operations, our exhibits, our collections. If you are not a member, we would encourage you to become one, and you can either see myself or either Dick or Gail after the tour if you're interested in learning more about the association. We operate the Millyard Museum in the Millyard over on Bedford Street, which is open Tuesday through Saturday. And if you have not been there, we encourage you to come and visit. We're open today until 4 o'clock. And we'll give you, if you are not a member and you would like admission, you get free admission with your tour today. Before I hand this over to Dick to begin, just want to announce a couple of upcoming programs that we have. The last walking tour of the season is of Pine Grove Cemetery. It will be on Saturday, September 23rd, same time, 10 to noon. And the same prices, so that'll be the last tour of the cemetery. We encourage you to come to that. And also on this coming Tuesday, we have an exhibit opening at the Millyard Museum called Queen City Quilts, which will be showcasing several of the quilts in our collection that were made by Manchester people. And to go along with that, on Saturday, September 16th, there will be a lecture starting at 10 o'clock at the museum called New England Quilts and the Stories They Tell. So thank you again for coming, and I'm going to turn this over to Dick.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? And can you realize that you're listening to the microphone, right? You're listening through, it's being amplified. You can hear it all right? Welcome to today's tour of St. Augustine Cemetery. This is a tour we haven't done in many years, and we're pleased to do it again. The Reverend Joseph A. Chevalier, the pioneer Franco-American priest in Manchester, is credited with purchasing the land for this cemetery. In 1878, he purchased 10 acres of land. The cemetery was named St. Mary's, not St. Augustine, but St. Mary's, and was known as St. Mary's for about 20 years, actually, until 1898, when the name was changed to St. Augustine's. The first burial took place on December 14, 1878. We know from early newspaper accounts that some of the early Franco-Americans in Manchester were buried in the Valley Cemetery, as there was no Catholic burial ground in this city. About 1855, Reverend William MacDonald moved some of the Catholics to what is called today the Old St. Joseph Cemetery. Reverend Chevalier also moved some early burials from the Valley Cemetery to this site. We're going to proceed now to the first grave site. We're standing at the grave site of Moïse Sans-Souci. Moïse Sans-Souci was born in Saint-Césaire, province of Quebec, and emigrated to Manchester in 1865 at the close of the Civil War. He married Hermine Bonin, the sister of Louis Bonin, who was the very first Franco-American settler in Manchester. Louis Bonin arrived here in 1833. Mr. Sans-Souci was a carpenter by trade and later entered the real estate business and had large holdings in the Squag area of Manchester. Mr. Sans-Souci's family were early settlers of Providence, Rhode Island, where there is a large park known as Sans-Souci Park, named after the original settlers of the city. We're at the gravesite of Hyacinth Jutras. Hyacinth Jutras was one of the very first Franco-American settlers in Manchester, arriving in 1847. The following year, 1848, he was the best man at the marriage of Louis Bonin, the first Franco-American to settle here, to Miss Henriette Bonfant. Tragedy seemed to follow the Jutras family. Hyacinth, a roof slater by trade, fell to his death from a 3-story house near Rockrimmon. Later, one of his sons fell as well, breaking his arm so severely that lockjaw set in, killing him. His brother, also a slater, fell from the steeple of the stock mill and was killed instantly. I'm at the gravesite of John Blanchard. John Blanchard was born in Quebec and emigrated to Manchester about 1871. He found employment in the Amoskeag weave room and later in the Langdon Mill. In 1880, he opened a saloon on Amherst Street and a few months after bought one on Crawford Street. From here on, we will refer to an account of what took place given by Philippe Lemay, an early Franco-American immigrant to Manchester. The account was given to WPA, that's the Works Progress Administration in the 30s, writer Louis Père in 1938 as follows. On the night of September 30th, 1880, John Blanchard and 4 friends who all belonged to the French band were all talking quietly about its leadership, in French of course, on Amherst Street, near the corner of Vine. It was a little after 11 o'clock. 3 Irishmen came out of another beer parlor located nearby on the same street. 3 Irishmen came out of another beer parlor located nearby on the same street. They hated to hear French spoken and called on the 5 frogs to talk United States. They rushed the French Canadians as they passed them. The 3 attackers were drunk. Blanchard pushed them away. One of the 3, a man named Powers, came at John, who again pushed him, and once more the assailant fell to the sidewalk. A large round beer bottle was broken in the fall. The man was furious. He threw the broken bottle and struck Blanchard on the left side of the throat. The jagged edge of the broken bottle made a wound 1 inch deep and 2 inches long and cut the jugular vein. Blanchard would soon be bathed in blood, coming out so fast that nobody could stop the flow. His friends took him to his room. They laid him down on the floor where a pool of blood formed. A piece of glass, the pointed end sticking out, was still in the wound. It was removed by a friend who had his hand over the gaping hole trying to stop the constant flow of blood. He died 20 minutes after having been hit, having lost all his blood. A crowd of French Canadians gathered at the spot and said, "This is where the Irishmen killed John Blanchard." The Irishman who threw the bottle was charged with murder and served 5 years in prison.
The Irishman that threw the bottle and went to prison was James Dukes Quinn. He got Dukes for using his fist. He was a vicious thug. He was always in trouble with the police. He died. When he died, it was over in Grashmere at the poor house, the poor farm. He was 38 years old. But he was best known for killing live rats with his teeth.
Obviously.
That was new to me.
This is the grave of Wasi Verret, who was born in Stanfield, PQ. You may be sensing a theme now that most of these people came from Quebec. While still a child, his family immigrated to Manchester. At 14 years of age, he found employment in the Stark Mills. After a short time, he left there to open a barber shop at 618 Elm Street. In 1885, Mr. Verret and Damas Pigeon opened a grocery store at 609 Elm Street, where the Verizon Arena stands today. Before long, Wasi became sole proprietor. Verret Market became one of New Hampshire's largest grocery stores and the first in the state to install refrigerated counters. In 1916, he was elected to the Governor's Council, being the first Franco-American to hold that position. and in 1917 he became the first Franco-American to ever hold the office of mayor in Manchester. At his inauguration, the Reverend A Chevalier became the first Catholic clergyman in the history of Manchester to assist in the exercises. He and Father Chevalier became citizens of Manchester at the same time in 1871. Mayor Verret's ability to speak fluently in French and English enabled him to bring about a better understanding between the two nationalities and to make him many friends in both communities. Mr. Verret was a member of the Joliet Club, Association Canadian American, and the St. Jean Baptiste Society.
In the second term of office, he took his oath in his bed at his home on Spruce Street. He had arthritis so severely that crippled him.
Next to him is his friend, Reverend Chevalier. Reverend Joseph Augustine Chevalier was born in Assumption, PQ. He received an elementary education in his native town and then studied for priesthood at College of the Assumption. He was ordained August 11, 1867. In May of 1871, he was sent by Bishop Bacon of Portland, Maine, to establish a French-speaking parish in Manchester. He became the pioneer Franco-American priest in this city. Father Chevalier founded St. Augustine's Parish and named it after his patron saint, St. Augustine. 3 days after his arrival in the city, he called a meeting of the Franco-Americans in the basement of St. Anne's Church. He celebrated the first Mass in Smith's Hall on Elm Street. An improvised altar was made from a table. The following Sunday Mass was held again at Smith's Hall, but after that, Father Chevalier rented the old Faneuil Hall at Pleasant and Elm Street, and for 10 months this place served as a temporary temple for the parishioners of St. Augustine's. In April 1872, he rented a former Baptist church at the corner of Merrimack and Pine Streets. It was known as the French Church. On May 16, 1872, Bishop Bacon of Portland, Maine, laid the cornerstone of St. Augustine's Church. It was completed on November 27, 1873. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company gave the land for the church, and the cost was $40,000 for the building. In 1881, he founded the Notre Dame Academy, conducted by the Religious of Jesus Mary in Quebec. In 1889, he founded St. Augustine's Academy, run by the Brothers of the Sacred Heart from Quebec. In 1891, he founded the St. Vincent de Paul Hospice, an orphanage and school for orphans in charge of the Sisters of Providence. In 1916, he founded a boarding school for girls known as the Villa Augustina. And in 1944, a Liberty Ship War Bond campaign was sponsored by the Franco-Americans of New England. 6 names of prominent Manchester Franco-Americans were submitted as names for the ships. And on May 2nd, 1944, the name for the Liberty Ship was chosen, and it was named the Reverend Joseph A. Chevalier. On July 3rd, 1944, the Liberty Ship Reverend Joseph Chevalier was launched from Portland, Maine.
Which was unusual at his time. They didn't get along, as you just saw with the Blanchard trade. But the Irish were the ones that raised money to fund the church in the beginning, and he never forgot that. And they used to wine and dine him, the bishops. He was a great friend of all the Irish.
Lieutenant William Jutras was the second Franco-American to die in World War I. He died from wounds received in action from a battle at Saint Michel, France, on September 26, 1918. He was a member of the Lafayette Guards, Company A, 103rd Infantry. He was 27 years old. He was the only Manchester officer of the Yankee Division to earn a Distinguished Service Cross. William H. Jutras Post, American Legion, was named in his honor in August of 1919. A building bearing his name stood at the corner of Bridge and McGregor Streets. A portion of the land where this building stood is now occupied by the Henry Barrasso high-rise building for the elderly of Manchester. That's across from St. Mary's Bank. As a result, the post is now located on Boutwell Street, a short distance from its original location. His body was returned from France in 1921. On July 4th, 1921, ceremonies were held from Jutras Post Hall where his body was waked. After the ceremonies were finished, bearers carried the body to a caisson in front of the post hall. It was then strapped and taken to St. Augustine's Church for religious ceremonies. Strapping is you tie a body down so it doesn't move around in transit. The body was received at the church by Reverend Louis Ramsey, post chaplain. When services were ended, the procession followed Beach Street where he was laid to rest. A volley was fired and taps sounded. Every Memorial Day, a firing squad from American Legion, Post 43, the Jutras Post, goes to the flag dedication area at North Main Street at the Barrasso high-rise to pay honor to William Jutras. The firing squad then goes to Mount Calvary Cemetery to the Jutras lot, where 50 members are buried, and fires 3 volleys. The final firing of the volleys is here at the grave site of Lieutenant William Jutras.
Really good. I'm at the grave site of Joseph P. Chattel. Joseph Chattel was born in Stukely, province of Quebec, and came to Manchester in 1868 at 14 years of age, leaving his family in Canada. He immediately found employment at the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. After leaving there, he apprenticed in the barber business and then opened a shop on Merrimack Street, in which he conducted business successfully for 18 years. Mr. Chattel gave up this business and with a friend embarked in the grocery business. This business as well resulted in financial disaster amounting to an indebtedness of $3,400. In 1892, he then went to work as a traveling salesman for a wholesale liquor business. In 1894, he opened a wine store on Manchester Street under the name of J.P. Chattel and Company. You can still see that name, Chattel, on some of the brickwork if you go in back in the alley, in back of the stores on Manchester Street. He became one of the most successful wholesalers of liquor in New Hampshire and continued in that business until Prohibition in 1919 when he retired. In 1898, he became the first Franco-American ever elected to the New Hampshire State Senate. Mr. Chattel was one of the founders of St. Augustine's Parish. Mr. Chattel, to repeat myself, was one of the founders of St. Augustine's Parish. He was a charter member of the Cours Saint-Georges No. 1 ACA. I'm standing at the gravesite of Georges Blanchette. Mr. Blanchette was born in Stamford, province of Quebec, and was an early immigrant to Manchester, arriving in 1866. His first employment was with the photographers Stark and Piper, a well-known firm at that time. Later, he left them to begin his mercantile career in the firm Holton and Sprague, where he acquired valuable knowledge of business methods and principles which were to serve him well later in life. He resigned from that position and became proprietor of the Golden Fleece, which is one of Manchester's most successful dry goods firms. I might mention that until the early 1890s, it was legal in Manchester to have signs over the sidewalk. And if you had a sheep over the sidewalk, that could be equated with fleece, which could be equated with a dry goods store. So if an immigrant didn't know the language, couldn't read English easily, he could identify with the signs over the store. So there were signs like the sign of the big chair, which was a furniture store, and so on and so forth. He remained in this business for 15 years. Leaving that, he went into the insurance business with much success for 25 years. He organized the Prudential Fire Insurance Company in Manchester. He was an original member of the Manchester Board of Trade, now known as the Chamber of Commerce. He served on the Common Council in the late 1880s, the state legislature, in the early 1890s and the police commission for 3 years. Mr. Blanchette was also a member of the Club Joliet, the Cercle National, the Saint-Jean the Baptist Society, and the Canada American Association. Mr. Blanchette was an early automobile enthusiast, and actually he had as good a looking car as anywhere that existed in Manchester. Mr. Blanchette, a very important person in the history of Manchester. I'm at the grave site now of Frank Laflamme. Mr. Laflamme was born in Montreal, Quebec, and at 19 years of age he emigrated to Manchester and found work in the Amherst Manufacturing Company for a brief period, and then he entered the contracting business. He became one of the most successful Franco-American contractors in Manchester's history. He built 19 churches in New England. Among some other buildings in Manchester done by him were the Arcadia Ballroom at Massabesic Lake, the Joliet Club, which became the ACA on Concord Street and is now a church, the Eagle Theater, which became the Vitaphone Theater, which is now torn down, and the original St. Anthony's Church, also torn down, and the Belgian Club on the west side, which may still be there, I think. That's torn down too, I'm told. At any rate, of all the things we've mentioned, there's only one that is still there, which is what was the ACA and is now a church on Concord Street. Mr. Laflamme was a member of the Association Canado-Americaine, the Order of Eagles, the Joliet Club, the Lafayette Club, and the Order of Maccabees. At this gravestone is the gravestone of Frank Rainville, who was born in Louisville, Kentucky. He came to Manchester on April 1st, 1865, his father being a Confederate soldier in the Civil War who was killed in action. Mr. Rainville served on the Manchester Police Force for 20 years and was a pioneer parishioner of St. Augustine's Church.
This is Francis Barrasso, who was born in Yamachichi near Three Rivers, PQ. He arrived in Manchester in 1846, being one of the pioneer Franco-Americans in the city. At the time he came here, there were only 8 other people of his nationality in the entire city. Mr. Barrasso ran a barber shop on Concord Street for many years. His wife Margaret came to the city before the railroad reached here. The first train was in June 28, 1842, and she was one of the weavers who started Stark Mill No. 3. She was also the first woman to start a Franco-American boarding house in Manchester. Their son Frank was one of the earliest Franco-American policemen in the city. This is John Alfred Majo, who was an early Franco-American physician here in Manchester, and he came to the city about 1875. He was a Joliet, province of Quebec. He died in 1882 of tuberculosis, which is kind of a bummer for a doctor. He was a member of the St. Jean Baptiste Society. To my right is the grave of John Gru. He emigrated to Manchester from Canada about 1880 and found employment in the Amherst Manufacturing Company. He later opened a saloon at the corner of Wayne and McGregor Streets in West Manchester. In 1891, he bought an island in the Piscataqua River near Douglas Street, and it became known as Gru Island. For many years, picnics, dancing, boating, and swimming took place there. One of his daughters was named Winnie Ida, and she died from an overdose of ether during an operation.
Wouldn't you? That we would have known where it was. The flood of 1896, which was just as bad as the one of 1936, rose up halfway up these houses, according to the drawing here. And actually, if you go down Milford Street and you come to where the Theodore, isn't it called the Theodore Playground was? Before you get there, the Theodore Swimming Pool, before you get there, there's a park, the Piscataqua Park, and you turn down to the right, and once you get down to the Piscataqua, you can look up and you can still see the island today. There's no houses on it. After that flood, that was the end. They realized they'd made a mistake, but they lost all that property.
In 1941, the Manchester Historic Association was given a sandpiper and a glass from Gru Island.
To my left is Abraham George Grenier, who was born in L'Abbaye, PQ, and emigrated to Manchester at the age of 19 in 1873. He took employment as a bookkeeper for H. Faulkner, the grocery. In 7 years, he became the owner of the business and was very successful, becoming one of Manchester's largest grocers and heaviest taxpayers. In 1882, he was the first Franco-American ever elected to office in Manchester, being elected to the Common Council by the Republican Party, and he served until 1886. He was also the first Franco-American bank director in Manchester. His wife was Leonie Quirin, the sister of Joseph and Eugene Quirin, both successful Manchester businessmen. He was a prime mover in the formation of the Board of Trade in Manchester and was a member of the St. Jean-Baptiste Society. His generosity was long remembered by the Franco-American community of Manchester. Mr. Grenier was one of the most active in the formation of the St. George Parish, and at the first parish bazaar, he won the honor of naming the church. He presented the massive figure of St. George and the Dragon, which occupied a niche in the outer wall of the church. He was also the first Franco-American in Manchester to have a telephone installed in his store, which is located at 1018 Elm Street, and this was in October of 1881. He was one of the founders of the Franco-American Naturalization Club in 1882, and in 1891 he founded the Lafayette Freight Elevator Company.
The gravesite of Evangeliste Turcotte, who was born in Stamford, province of Quebec in 1865. At 16 years of age, he went to work in the cloth room of the Amesquet Manufacturing Company. 4 years later, the boy who had arrived in Manchester, almost penniless, had acquired sufficient capital from his savings to invest in a coal and wood yard at 196 Manchester Street, which is approximately where Freed's Bakery used to be. This business grew to large proportions. In 1881, he opened an undertaking and embalming establishment at the same location. So on one side was the wood that he was selling, and on the other side was his undertaking establishment. He was one of the very first Franco-Americans to embark on the undertaking business in Manchester. He was one of the oldest parishioners of St. Augustine's Church and was a member of the committee which welcomed to the city the first French-speaking Catholic priest, Reverend Joseph Augustin Chevalier. Mr. Turcotte was a charter member of the St. Jean-Baptiste Society, the Cours Saint-Georges No. 1 ACA, and the Cours Saint-Augustine No. 3 ACA, a member of the Franco-American Board of Trade of New England as well. In 1891 and 1892, he represented the Republicans in Ward 4 in the Common Council. Upon his death in 1908, his son-in-law, J. Michael Doherty, assumed the ownership of the business. I saw an advertisement that was done for him, and I'll never forget it, because even funeral homes in the 20th century, even say 30, 40 years ago, would rent out their hearses as ambulances. In other words, if there was an ambulance, you needed to go to the hospital, you would call up the funeral home, because ambulances were not, that prevalent. And they would put something right over where it said funeral home, and it would say ambulance, right? Well, you can see how they could double. That could double for two different purposes. But Mr. Turcotte had an ad, and it said, "Funeral hacks for hire for weddings, funerals, and the like." And it always struck me that weddings and funerals have one thing in common. They're both final.
There was one woman who rented one there. Her name was Mrs. Ashland. So he drove it, and it was such a bouncy ride that she gave premature birth, so she sued him later.
Buried here are Cyril and Lee Lebrun. Her maiden name was Boucher. Mrs. Lebrun, we believe, was the second Franco-American to ever arrive in Manchester. She came here in 1836. Her husband in 1843. They were one of the earliest marriages recorded in the Catholic faith. They were married by the pioneer priest William MacDonald on May 18, 1851. Their son, Cyril Jr., ran a very successful dancing academy on Elm Street. John Lebrun was an administrator general. He was an admirer of General Stark, and naming his camp at Massapequa Lake the Stark, and his boat Molly Stark. Now, James W. Doherty, and we'll talk about Doherty and the so-called Doherty case. In the Manchester Union, on October 14, 1887, it reads as follows. James W. Doherty was the son of Irish parents born on Canadian soil. He married a young French Canadian he had fallen in love with, and he never apparently had any reason to regret his choice as their married life went on with smoothness, and the 5 children that came to bless the union as well, and he added to the joyousness of their marital career. Mr. Doherty, in the meantime, came to this city and embarked on the baking business, carrying on a store at Elm and Bridge Street and having his bakery itself in West Manchester. He prospered, and his wife was thrifty, and in the course of time he accumulated some $5,000 to $6,000. About 6 years before, as the news article relates, his wife died, and then there was a change. There was a change upon the scene. Gradually, Doherty's business fell away. His friends noticed that his habits were not as regular as of yore, when his wife's faithful and restraining hand guided him, and it was darkly hinted that drink was the cause of the trouble. Be that as it may, the house of Doherty was fast going to ruin, and 2 years before, the news reporter related, it passed into other hands. Now, the Doherty case was related in the Manchester Union Leader on October 13, 1887. The remains of James W. Doherty were received in this city from the county farm at Wilton by Undertaker X Jeannette. The body was clothed and wrapped in a sheet, and when the coffin lid was raised, it was found that not only the sheet, but the body was covered with vermin. A newspaper man was called in and was able to discern insects in the hair and whiskers of the dead man. It was understood, the disbelieving reporter wrote, that Mr. Doherty was well connected and was a former member of our most prominent French-Canadian society. I'm at the gravesite now of Frank X Jeannette. Mr. Jeannette was born at Saint-Denis, province of Quebec, and emigrated to Manchester in 1864 at 9 years of age. His first employment was in the Namaskeg and then the Stark Mills. In 1872, he went into the Teamster business. 1874, he began dealing in the wood and coal business. And finally, in 1881, he opened an undertaking business, being the first Franco-American to do this in Manchester. The same year, he opened a livery stable on Chestnut Street. He had a lifelong interest in horses and owned some of the best trotting horses in Manchester, which he raced at the old driving park on South Willow Street. If you remember where Sylvania was one of the first buildings built on the site of the vast acreage of the driving park. He had a full-time veterinarian as an employee. He once painted a horse green for the 4th of July parade, but was stuck with the animal, for he could not get the paint off and was unable to sell it. So there's the moral of the story, is don't paint a horse green. I can remember a football game at Tufts University, and they painted a cow purple for Williams College because that was the symbol of purple cow. I never asked if they got the paint off though. In the mid-1880s, he entered the real estate market and began moving a number of houses to his land in South Manchester, where he established Jeannetteville, named after him. This land today is about where Lyons Iron Works stands on Maple Street, the Bank of New Hampshire on South Beach Street, which is now a coffee mug place. I don't know what it's called. Rifke's Car Wash on South Willow, and P.J. O'Sullivan's at Maple and South Willow. That name has changed as well. It consisted of over 20 acres of land. The street next southerly of what was the Bank of New Hampshire is called Jeannette Avenue, and some of the oldest houses in Manchester are in that area. His farm stood near the shores of Nuts Pond, known today as Precourt Pond. Mr. Jeannette was known for his charitable disposition, and he gave liberally of his money. His philanthropic work was closely identified with the Notre Dame Hospital and the orphanage. One of the orphan girls he had placed appeared at his funeral. Mr. Jeannette was a member of the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society and the Canada American Order of Saint-Pierre. Item. In the presidential election of 1884, Mr. Jeannette placed a bet that the winner would be James G. Blaine. Since Grover Cleveland was elected, Mr. Jeannette lost the bet. The bet was that the loser would wheel a man in a wheelbarrow from the corner of Chestnut and Merrimack Streets to City Hall. You don't do that today. You know. Although it's a thought, they may start after this tour. It is recorded that Mr. Jeannette paid off his bet. He wheeled the man to City Hall.
Edmund Bernard was born in Monique, PQ. He emigrated to Manchester in 1873 at the age of 16. In 1887, he opened a market at 1157 Elm Street, decades later to be the address of Ferretti's grocery store, which he operated successfully for 40 years. In 1893, he bought 40 acres of land in Goffstown and began to develop Bernardville, which was named after him. The entire tract of land in his purchase was laid out in streets and lots by Mr. Bernard. He was a key player in the erection of the Kelly Falls Bridge, and he offered free land on the Bernardville side of the river if the bridge was erected. This came to pass in 1914 with the building of the bridge, which in turn helped to develop Bernardville as Mr. Bernard wished. A number of prominent citizens of that area wanted Manchester to annex Bernardville from Goffstown. In 1911, Mr. Bernard gave the land to the Diocese of Manchester, where St. Edmund's Church and School were erected at the corner of Bernard and Edmund Street, both named after him. Mr. Bernard donated the rectory as well for the church. Henrietta Street was named for his wife. Mr. Bernard was one of the heaviest donors to the building fund of St. George's Church, and his name was on the large stained glass window behind the high altar of the church.
And he ran a saloon for many years on Crockett Street. So if he shut you off and you didn't go peacefully, he threw you out bodily.
A school teacher and a merchant, he was educated at both French and English schools in the locality. He emigrated to Manchester in 1873 at the age of 19, where he found employment with Barton and Company and Weston and Hill, and was considered a superior salesman. On January 24, 1895, he engaged in business for himself under the firm name of Meville and Deschenez. In 1900, the name was changed to Manchester Dry Goods Company. He was among a small group who pioneered the Franco-American business movement in Manchester. After his death, his son, Louget Deschenez, carried on the business successfully for many years. He was a prominent member of the Joliet Club, St. Jean-Baptiste Society of America, the Dairyfield Club, the Elks Club, and the Amoskeag Veterans. Upon his death in March 1917, the Manchester Mirror carried a lengthy editorial honoring him. It ended with the following words, quote, "Manchester will miss Jules Deschenez in innumerable ways, and all the interests will learn with sincere regret and sorrow that we may count him among us no longer. He has left a record of shining achievement and success,